In this demo, I will be installing AWS PowerShell tools. PowerShell has been around since 2006, but at that time it ran only on Windows and there were limited commandlets. But since that time, there are numerous modules. Modules are collections or libraries of related PowerShell commandlets for a variety of different products, and not just Microsoft. For example, VMware has a collection of PowerShell modules just for managing VMware environments at the PowerShell command line. And of course, Amazon Web Services has tools specifically for managing AWS resources using PowerShell. So here in my browser, I've gone to aws.amazon.com/PowerShell, where I have the AWS Tools for PowerShell webpage. So I've got some help here. I've got a Get Started button, but I've also got the option to install AWS Tools for PowerShell from PowerShell Gallery, or I could download a zip file. And these days, PowerShell is actually cross-platform. You can run PowerShell not just on Windows, but also on the Mac OS and on Linux. So I'm going to choose AWS Tools for PowerShell Modular Recommended. When I click on that, it's downloading a zip file. So we're going to go ahead and unzip that. So I'm going to right-click on the zip. I'm going to choose Extract All, and I'll just go ahead and extract it into its own folder. So here in PowerShell, the next thing I need to do is I need to find out where my PowerShell modules are installed on this computer. I've spawned an administrator PowerShell session on my on-premises computer. So I'm going to run $env for environment variables, I want the environment variable called PS module path. This reveals the local path on this machine where all my PowerShell modules are installed. And remember, a module is a library. It's a collection of related PowerShell commandlets organized into the module. Back here in the extracted zip file, notice that my AWS tools here, each of them is a separate category or a separate module. So AWS tools for API gateway versus for app config versus AWS tools for EC2. So we've got module folders that contain other subfolders and the actual files like PSM PowerShell module files. Basically, you need to copy these into your local modules directory. So here on my computer, I've navigated to C, Windows, System32, Windows PowerShell v1.0, and I've done this in the File Explorer tool. And so here's the modules folder. I'm just going to open that up. Any existing modules or collections of related PowerShell commandlets, like for BitLocker or for the DNS client and so on, are here. All I'm going to do is paste in all of the ones that I've downloaded and unzipped. And so all of my AWS tool modules then are being copied into my modules folder, which will make them accessible from the PowerShell command line. And so back here in PowerShell, I could issue statements like get-command *, which is a wildcard symbol, EC2, to find out if I have any commandlets that have EC2 in their name. And immediately, there are plenty of them. So I could take it a step further and say, well, if I use the up arrow key to bring up that command, what about if I look for the word new, as in the creation of a new EC2 instance? Well, there's a lot of new EC2 stuff, but sure enough, I will find new-EC2 instance. Alternatively, what you could do is run install-module-name, and then it's called aws.tools.installer. You're doing this by installing it from online from the PowerShell gallery. It asks if you want to trust the repository. Press the letter A for yes to all. Now, all this does is set up the installer so that I can then choose which other PowerShell modules I wish to install. For example, if I know I'm going to be working with EC2 and S3 buckets, then what I might do is run install-aws tools module, and then I would tell it I want aws.tools.ec2, aws.tools.s3, and so on. And I'll press enter. Okay. And yet another way that you can run AWS tools for PowerShell is simply to connect to an AWS EC2 instance running Windows. If it's based on an Amazon machine image for Windows, then it already has AWS tools for PowerShell pre-installed. Let's take a look. So here in the EC2 Management Console, in the Instances view on the left, I've got a Windows server that's currently up and running. So I'm going to select it with the check mark, and I'll click Connect at the top, and I'll choose RDP Client. At which point, what I'm going to do is click Get Password. The username is administrator, but I have to browse for my private key for my key pair, and it's telling me it's using a key pair called Windows key pair. When I browse for that file, which I've downloaded previously, I'll be able to decrypt the administrator password and sign in, and finally check out AWS tools for PowerShell in the instance. Okay, so I'll click Decrypt Password, and now we know the username and the password for this VM. Now I could go back and retrieve the public IP and start RDP manually on my machine to make a connection, or I could just download the remote desktop file here, which I'll do. And I'll specify the decrypted password and I'll click OK. So here in my instance, I'm going to go ahead and go into the Start menu and I'll type in PowerShell. I'll right-click on Windows PowerShell and choose Run as Administrator. So the great thing about this is that the AWS tools for PowerShell is already installed. For example, if I run git-module-list *AWS*, it will then return that the AWS PowerShell module is there. So the next thing I need to do is authenticate to my AWS account. In PowerShell, I can do that with initialize-AWS defaults, first time I'm running this, -region. I'm specifying a region where I want to manage AWS of US-East-1. And it's asking for my AWS access key. Here in the console, if I were to click on my username in the upper right and choose Security Credentials, this is where I could open up access keys, where any existing access keys will be shown. These access keys allow programmatic access to AWS, even through PowerShell. Now, if I don't have the access key credentials, I can delete an older access key that I know is not needed. So I'll click Delete for one of them, and I'll choose Deactivate. I'll enter in the old access key ID in the input field, and I'll choose Delete. Now, the reason I've done that is because now it allows me to create a new access key. I'm going to choose Show Access Key. Notice we've got an access key ID and a secret access key. You need both of these. I'm going to download this key file and save it in a safe place and make sure it gets backed up. Back here in PowerShell, I will paste in that access key as well as the secret key. And if I were to enter a PowerShell command like git-s3 bucket, it would return a list of buckets in our AWS account because we are now successfully authenticated here in PowerShell.